Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to another Adobe XD Masterclass. My name is Howard Pinsky, Senior XD Evangelist here at Adobe, and I hope you're all doing well on this Friday afternoon, and happy Pride Month, everyone. Hope you're all good, hope you're all ready for the weekend, and I'm excited to get to another Adobe XD Masterclass. We're on number 56. Been at this for 56 weeks. Big thank you to everyone who has tuned in for all, if not most. Thank you. So if you're tuning in live here on Behance today, let me know in the chat who you are and where you're tuning in from. If you're on Twitter, hello Twitter friends. Can't see your chat over there, so head on over to behance.net/Adobe Live. We've got Gal and Alex and Wade, Cornell, Anita, Megan and Luca, Krishna, Ghislaine, Beverly, great to see all of you. New faces, familiar faces. You're all Katya and Gareth and Brett. Awesome. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and hop over to my screen and we are going to get started in Masterclass number 56. Alex is saying, I'm going to, because I don't seem to be able to do anything on XD, let alone Masterclass. So Alex, or anyone else, or Axel, sorry. If you're new to Adobe XD, we have a ton of resources. We have our Learn Hub, we have our daily creative challenges, which you can find right here on Behance. I have videos on YouTube, I'll show you that in a second. We just have a ton of resources, especially if you're just getting started. So be on the lookout for that. Maybe the mods will post some of those links as well. All right. So I am over here on Dribbble. This is my Dribbble profile. And the reason I'm over here is because we released some fancy new features last week, this week, I don't know days anymore. Sometime, I think it was this week, probably Tuesday, Monday night, Tuesday morning. Inner shadows, outline stroke, and angular gradients. I know many of you have been waiting for those for quite some time. The team has been working on a lot of design features, and these ones were ready. So we threw them out the door. And naturally, I started creating some very obnoxious, over-the-top, skeuomorphic elements. Because why not, right? Whenever we have new features that I've been testing internally, I like to go crazy with these things. Obviously, there are much more subtle things you can do with inner shadows, outline stroke, and angular gradient. But I like to push the bounds, because why not, right? Although it does seem like we're kind of moving in that skeuomorphic direction again. Apple announced their new operating systems, and they started to throw a little bit of skeuomorphic touches into iOS 15. Very subtle, but I think we might be moving in that direction, especially with AR and VR growing in popularity. So we're going to create some of these elements today. I don't know how many we'll get to, but we're going to do that. And just to kind of give you an example of what you can do with some of these styling options, auto animate, 3D transforms, and one of the versions of this also had some audio in it that kind of ticked as this dial went around. Fancy, right? All right, I did mention YouTube a little bit earlier. Are you late? You are not late. You are just on time. So I released a few videos on the new features. This one over here touches on all three of them. And then this one's one of my new 1-minute tips. So if you want to check out the new features after the live stream, definitely do that. And if you're like Axel and you're kind of just getting into XD, or you're looking for some inspiration, tutorials, that sort of thing, youtube.com/Howard Pinsky. All right, let's go ahead and hop over to Adobe XD. We're going to get going. For this, I'm not building it for anything specific, so I'm not too concerned about iPhone or web or Instagram story, but I may be wanting to upload it to Dribbble at some point, like I showed you a few minutes ago. So 1600 by 1200 is a nice 4:3 aspect ratio that Dribbble supports. You can go larger, you can go smaller, but it's a nice balance. So we're going to go ahead and start with a custom artboard, and I'm going to name this Obnoxious Dials. So we're going to start with the dials. I don't know if we'll have time for the rest, but we will see. All right. So the first thing we want to do here is really start setting up the background for this particular design. Because the background, when you're working with things like these skeuomorphic elements that have these indents. You might be able to see right here, right? The background is very important so that the blend modes and the drop shadows and all that fun stuff interact really nicely with it, especially if you're going for a specific design like this rustic look that I'm after. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with a nice solid color. You can of course start with a linear, radial, or the new Angular gradient, but I'm going to start with a solid color. We're going to go somewhat brownish, maybe a little bit brighter. We can always tweak this later, but we're going to start in this area here. And then to add a little bit of texture onto this background, we're going to add in some images. So I'm going to grab my rectangle tool, shortcut key R. You can grab the rectangle on the left-hand side as well, and view, just like that, and make a rectangle. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can very easily drag an image into this, and it's going to automatically mask it. Hey, Umacorn, great to see you. All right, so I'm going to hop over to Finder, and we're going to start with, let's say, maybe these speckles. I have a lot of these textures from Adobe stock, and I'm going to grab this and drag it directly in. And if you're new to XD, you're going to notice that as you drag your images on top of shapes, rectangles or ellipses, polygons, path, right? Boop. You can just drop it right in there, and it masks it really nicely. And of course, you can double click if you need to and enlarge it. All right, now to have this interact nicely with the background, I might want to change the blend mode to something like soft light, and then maybe drop the opacity so we have a very nice, subtle, speckly look. And it might be difficult to see on the video because compression creates speckles anyway, but if I zoom in here, you can kind of see, we're dealing with a nice raster image. So it's a little bit pixelated. I did resize these images downwards because the images you get on Adobe stock are very large. Some of them are, 5 to 10 megabytes each. So I did resize these down. So that's why some of them a little bit speckly. All right, next we might want one more image. So I'm going to duplicate this, Command and Control D, and this one's going to be more of like a spattery look. So back in Finder, I do have this image here again from Adobe stock, and boop. And this one I will set to something like hard light. I would definitely encourage you to experiment with many of these blend modes, because depending on the background, depending on other images that might be present, the blend modes might have to be changed, right? Screen might look better in this case, or overlay. Let's try hard light, but drop the opacity. Let's try about 10%. And that'll leave us with just a few of these little white splatters, just to give it a little bit of extra texture, right? All right, how did they come up with those skeuomorphic? I don't know. I don't know where that word came from. Maybe if someone in the chat knows, let me know, because I have no idea. I just run with it. I know there's also neumorphic and neumorphism, which is kind of like new, right? New, N-E-U, something like that, and then morphic. So it kind of plays off of skeuomorphic. I don't know where the original came from. I should probably find out. All right, I'm going to group these and call this background. All right, beautiful. So we have our background in place. And again, important because some of the elements on top of this are going to interact, hopefully very nicely with that. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to set up the base. And because we're going for this skeuomorphic depth look, I'm going to grab the rectangle, draw one out, something like this. Zoom on in. And I might want to round out the corners completely. So I'll just like that, drag those edges in. And now we can start our styling. So we're gonna play around with a few things, right? We're gonna start with our fill, and we're gonna go for sort of like a medium gray, somewhere in this area here. Again, like the background, you can always go back and make changes. So if I wanted the background a different color, maybe some blue, right? Or if I wanted it lighter or darker, you can definitely do that later on. All right, so we're gonna go for a medium gray, and that will allow us to set a blend mode like hard light, which again will interact nicely with the shapes behind it. And then we might want something like a darker gray border. And I'll explain why this border is going to be important in just a moment. I'm gonna bump it up a little bit in size to about 2. A lot of this, especially when you're working with skeuomorphic design, a lot of it is experimentation. These examples that I showed you, this is like version 72 or something like that. I spent probably 20 hours experimenting with these textures and blend modes and all sorts of different things until I got to this point, and I'm still not completely happy with it. But if you saw the earlier designs, maybe I'll find them at some point, pull them up. They're very basic, and they didn't have all these textures and these glows and things like that. So things like this take a lot of time. All right, so maybe I'll take this border down a little bit, about 50% for the opacity. And then we might want to start experimenting with some of our shadows. And this is where the newer features come into play. So we have inner shadow. And if you're familiar with inner shadows in other applications like Photoshop, right? It adds a nice little inner shadow, right? So I'll set it somewhat, somewhat not too deep, so about 5 maybe. And then I might want to blur it quite a bit. And then we might want a bit of a drop shadow. Now this one, we want it to interact with the color in the background. So what I'm gonna do in this case is we're gonna keep the opacity fairly low, somewhere around 20%. And we might wanna go white, but also bring in a little bit of color. So we're dealing with more of a, a brownish green background. So I'm gonna set it in that area. And then just pull this over. So this little guy here, I'm just pulling it over to the right, just to bring in a little bit of color. And 3 for the Y position should work. I'm gonna set the blur at 0. Now, you might be wondering why I'm setting the blur at 0 if I want this nice soft indent. And that's because we have all these different styles. We have a border, we have an inner shadow, and we have a drop shadow. I might want all of them to be equally blurred. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna actually switch this over from background blur to object blur and just set it somewhere around 1, just so we have a nice, very subtle shadow going on here, right? And you can experiment with this. You can go 1, you can go 2 if you want to. And it may look a little bit weird right now, but once we start adding additional elements on top of this, it'll start to look a little bit better, especially when additional drop shadows come into play. And we can always go back and make tweaks once we have additional elements. So now on top of this, I'm just gonna go ahead and name this indent. And looking at this, it doesn't look that exciting, right? And I can go ahead and, tweak. Oh, look at that. Right? One little tweak. We've got that and that. Blend mode set to hard light still, but we just changed the color a little bit. And now it looks a little bit more depthy. It's probably not a word, but we're gonna run with it. All right, now over top of this, what we want is this ring to kind of go around this element, and it's going to house that fabric that we're gonna be adding shortly. And just to give you a reminder of what we're gonna be working on is this ring right around this shape here, right? Now, there are a few ways we can make this ring, including using a border and outline stroke, but what we're gonna do instead is we're gonna be using Boolean objects. So I have this shape selected. It's the shape that I want. So I'm going to duplicate this and I'm going to bring this inwards a little bit. Let me actually clear some of these styles just so I can see what we're working with. And I'm going to bring it in on the sides as well. I'm holding down my Alt or Option key. Hey, Chris, great to see you. And I'm just dragging in, and I want just a little bit. So I don't want too much, right? Just a little bit inwards. And you can hold down your Alt or Option key and hover. And right now it's 11 pixels. Let's try to get it. 10 might work, possibly. This isn't going to be used for development, so I'm not too worried about using 8 pixel grids and things like that. And then I want one more shape on the inside that we'll be able to use to cut this out. So duplicating one more time. I'm going to bring this in again. And I want a nice bezel on this side, right? And again, I can hold down, that looks pretty good. And then, all right, perfect. Just make sure everything's rounded, everything looks pretty good. And now what I want to do is select this shape here, and then select the shape in the background right behind it. So I'm holding down my Shift key and clicking. And then right here at the top, we have our Boolean option. So we have our add, subtract, intersect, exclude. We want subtract so that we can take that top shape and cut a hole into the shape behind it. And then we're left with something like this. And what's really nice is all of this remains completely editable. So it's non-destructive. So you can just dive in here. I'm going to name this ring. I can just dive in here, grab this shape, and then pull it on inwards a little bit more if I wanted to. 24 looks pretty nice. And 24, there we go. So now it's a little bit thicker, which is great. All right. Wade says depthy is Pinsky in origin, the depth distance from a surface plus y-ish depthy. I like that, Wade. I like it. All right. So now that we have this in place, we can start styling it. And this is going to be made up of 3 layers because we want the depth, we want a shiny chrome look, and we also want maybe some additional texture that looks like scratches. So this is going to be the base color. So I'm going to name this just so we know what we're working with. Base color. And now we're going to dive into Angular Gradients. So I'm going to hop into my fill, and typically I would probably do like a linear or a radial gradient. Instead, we're going to go ahead and choose Angular, just like that. And if you haven't used Angular Gradients before, you can go ahead and go around this circle and start adding stops. You can either do that directly on your canvas by clicking, or you can do that directly in this color picker as well. Now this little area here gets a little bit crammed, especially if you start adding a lot of colors. So keep that in mind. It might be easier to do that directly on canvas. But let's go ahead and let's start adding in some colors here. So we've got this brownish color here. Now I will point out that the colors on the far left and far right actually connect right here. So if you want a nice smooth transition, just make sure to copy this color or sample it from the left and then pop it on the right. So right over here, we have a nice smooth transition. And now we can start going through and adding in some darker colors, some lighter colors, a little bit of red and orange in there. And again, you can do that directly on your canvas as well. It might make it a little bit easier because again, at the top in this color picker, it gets a little bit squishy. And just like some of the other elements that we have created and will be creating, the blend modes, everything that's going to go on top of it, is going to really help define this color. So don't worry if it looks not great right now. It'll definitely start looking a little bit better as we continue to define this. I'm going to darken it on this side. Again, doesn't look great right now, but it will, I promise. Now, one more thing to keep in mind is when you add a gradient, whether it's a radial gradient or an angular gradient to a shape like this, a very long shape, it's going to create that gradient so that it fills the entire shape. So we have this weird kind of like squished oval look, right? But you might want it a little bit more round. So in that case, there's a handle, this one right up at the top. That one you can use to, where is it? Which handle is it? Where's that handle? That I can just pull it. Where is the handle? I'm losing my mind. I know it's here somewhere. That moves it. Where did the handle go? See, I'm losing my mind, people. Or is it just this? No. I don't know, people. Okay, I know you can do it. If I switch over to radial gradient, oh, there, it was hiding behind the thing. So this one, radial gradient, you can just do that, right? And, oh, no, it's not there. Okay, well, there we go. It's around, I promise. Maybe I ran into a bug, who knows? Or maybe I'm just going crazy and it's not there. But anyways, what we're gonna do now is we are going to, now that we have our base color looking pretty good, we are going to start adding in some additional elements, right? So we might want, for example, let's just double check something. All right, so we've got the angular gradient, and now we might want to start bringing in some additional elements. So, inner shadow, for example. We might want a very subtle inner shadow, maybe at the top, but we don't want this very, smooth and blurry inner shadow. We actually want a nice, very harsh, non-blurred inner shadow, right? So I'm gonna actually bring this down, let's say about 2, and then the blur we're gonna set to about 0. And then again, like we did with the indent, we can actually bring in a little bit of color. So we have a nice, almost like a gold look right here at the top, right? There we go. And then we might want to add a little bit of a drop shadow. Let's go for nice dark color. Maybe we'll just bump it up to about 60-65%. And then experiment with some of these values. All right. and blur it quite a bit. There we go. All right. So this ring is looking pretty good. Again, once we start adding in some of our chrome and some of our scratch textures, we might have to go back and revisit this, but we'll see. All right, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna duplicate this Boolean object, and this is going to be our chrome look. And for here, what we're gonna do is we're actually gonna turn off most of these styles, and we're gonna hop over to Finder. I'm gonna grab one of these images. You can either drag it directly in, just like that, or what you can do, let me actually cancel out of that, is you can copy it from Finder and then paste the appearance. So if you don't want to drag and drop, you can do that as well. And I'll set the blend mode to something like overlay. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see things come together, right? We have no chrome and we have chrome, right? And I can go back to my base color. Actually, let me add one more texture first. I'm gonna duplicate, and this will be our scratches. And we're gonna grab, where's Finder? There we go. We're gonna grab our scratches texture, which is this one right here. Copy it and paste it into place. Again, you can drag and drop if you want to. And I'll switch this over to something like soft light and maybe bring down the opacity a little bit to about 75%. And just like that, right, we have two textures that we added, the scratches and our chrome. And it took this fairly basic Angular gradient and looking pretty good. And now we can go back and start tweaking the gradient if we feel the need to, right? So maybe some of these down here, maybe we'll move a little bit over a touch, maybe darken. But overall, I think it's looking pretty good. Maybe I'll brighten this one a touch. And just go through and make some of these changes. But I'm pretty happy with it. All right, it's looking a little bit yellow in some places, and that's likely because of that chrome texture. It has a little bit of yellow in it, right? But you can always, use a different texture, or you can, experiment with some of the colors. Alrighty, perfect. So the ring is looking pretty good. I'm gonna group this and call this ring. And the next thing we might want to do is really start working on that fabric that's gonna go underneath this ring. So with the rectangle one more time, I'm gonna drag one out. And of course I could have duplicated this shape if I wanted to. And this one, we're not too concerned about cutting out holes or something like that. So I'm just gonna round it out. And I'm gonna make sure, we'll design it above the ring for now, but we're gonna move it behind that ring in a second. Cornell's asking, can you copy and paste multi-layer item appearances? I mean the copy whole ring appearance thing. So you can. So if you have, let me just show you here. So if you have a shape here, let me actually do an ellipse. So you have a shape here, let's go ahead and add, actually, if you have a shape here, right? And you want to copy the layer styles or the styling from the ring base color, just copy it to your clipboard, Command and Control C, hop over here and paste the appearance. Just like that, right? And if you have another shape, you can do the same thing. Or if you just duplicate this, you can grab, let's say the chrome, copy, and then paste appearance, or use that shortcut. All right. So on this fabric piece, what we're gonna do, we're gonna start very similar to the ring layers. We're gonna start with that base color. And we're gonna do a nice red color here. So something, I don't know, maybe a little bit darker. We'll likely have to go back and make some changes, but we'll see what that looks like. And we're gonna add a bit of a border, somewhere of like a dark red border. Maybe drop the opacity a little bit, 40, 50%. And I'm gonna bump up that border a little bit, right? And very similar to what we did earlier with the indent, we have a sharp border, but we're gonna be applying a little bit of an object blur so that that border gets a little bit softer and it almost acts as another shadow, which is really nice. And then we're gonna add an inner shadow on this shape. Now, right now, the inner shadow is gonna look very strange because we're gonna add, let's say, a nice reddish pink color, and we're gonna bump up the opacity. Let's try 75%. And we're gonna bump this quite up to about maybe 8. Blur it a little bit. We'll also bump up the Y position just so that it kind of grazes the left side of this shape a little bit. It looks okay, right? But without the textures, really don't know what it's going to completely look like just yet. And we're also going to blur this a touch. So we're going to just do like a object blur of, let's say 1. Whoops. 1, there we go. And if you take a look, if we bump up the size of the border, or if we adjust the opacity a little bit, you're noticing it, because we have that object blur, it acts as another shadow. And once we actually move this behind the ring layers, then we'll be able to tweak this to our liking. All right, Cornell's saying, another question, can you copy scratches, chrome, and base color layers appearance all at once? You can't, because they're all on separate layers. We don't have multiple effects on a single layer. So, and because they all have different blending modes. So I don't know how that would work, but it's an interesting question. But no, it doesn't work like that. Maybe one day, but I'm not sure exactly what the workflow would look like. All right, so we have our fabric, and this will be base color. And then we're going to duplicate this layer so that we can run. Gal says, reminds me of bevel and emboss. Indeed, it does. All right, so I'm going to duplicate this layer, and this is going to be where our texture is going to come into play. And we're not going to be needing many of these. We're not going to have an object blur. Probably won't need a border, but I'm going to hop over to Finder, and I'm going to grab, I have this texture, this fabric image, again, from Adobe stock. This is a lower res version that I shrunk down a little bit just so that the file sizes weren't too big. But if you do need much higher quality, I have those as well. So I'm going to copy those. I'm going to paste it, and now we have a texture, right? But it's not really interacting very well with the layer behind it, and that's where blend modes comes into play, as you've probably been seeing already. So I'm going to experiment. Let's try something like overlay. All right, not bad. A little bit harsh. Hard light, probably a little bit too harsh. Soft light's kind of a nice balance, right? Look at that. It's looking pretty good. So again, we have our fabric and no fabric. Just adding one of these textures just brings a whole new dimension to this design. Now, since we have this additional layer, we can go ahead and add an additional shadow. Now, we do have this shadow that came over from the previous layer, but we already have one at the top, so we probably don't want that. So what we can do is actually just bring this down to the bottom maybe, and then maybe, put the Y position into the negatives, let's say -5 or -6, something like that. And then maybe we'll blur it a little bit more. And then maybe we'll just set the X at 0. There we go. And because we have our blend mode set to soft light, it's okay to set the color at a pure black, because that'll still interact nicely with the layers behind it. Or if you did want to bring in a little bit more color, you can kind of just move it over to the right here and just pull it up a little bit. And now we have this nice, almost like a cushion on this fabric. And if we go ahead and group these two layers and then move it behind the ring, there we go. Now, this is kind of what I was talking about, right? Once we start moving layers and having them interact with other layers, we're going to have to make some tweaks. So I'm going to pull this down a little bit, actually pull it just like that on both sides. There we go. And then I'm going to dive into the fabric materials and maybe just experiment a little bit with the inner shadows. Pull that out a little bit. Maybe bump up the borders so we have a touch more of a shadow up there. And look how nicely it's interacting up at that top there. Blur it a touch more, and then on this one, maybe I'll drop the blur a little bit just so there's a nice soft cushion at the bottom. And look how this has come. Oop, looks like it's not centered perfectly. But look how nice this is coming along. It just has this great textured feel to it. It interacts really nicely with that ring on top of it, and because that ring, the base color, has a drop shadow, right? It's adding to that effect and depth even more. Maybe I'll drop this a touch. There we go. And that ring is sitting nicely in that indent, which we can always revisit. So maybe we can blur this a little bit more, possibly bring down the drop shadow. There we go. All right. Umicorn says, looks like it's poking out to me now. that's the beauty of skeuomorphic design. I know a lot of people hate this style of design, but being able to create something like this and have it look and feel realistic, like it's poking out at you, like Umacorn is saying, it's just magical, right? And especially, like I mentioned earlier, when this comes into AR or VR, all of a sudden you have these materials that look real. It's just a magical feeling. All right, so we have this looking pretty good. And now what we want to start doing is move on to the dials. And just to remind everyone, Laura just joined. Great to see you, Laura. We're working on something like this. And I'm thinking for this is we're going to start with the top of the dial, because maybe you don't want the sides to be seen. Maybe you just want the top of that dial, especially considering we have a top-down view of the ring and the fabric. So maybe you just want the top. But if we have time, we're going to get a bit fancy, as Nina is saying, fancy Friday indeed. And where are the images from? Adobe? Yes, they are from Adobe stock, and they have a ton of images. So if you just search like fabric texture or scratches texture, chrome texture, they have so many different textures. And there's also a free version of Adobe stock. So if you go to, let's say, stock.adobe.com, right at the top, there is free, and I forget how many dozens of thousands, like 70, 80,000 images. Fabric texture. Let's see if they have any free fabric texture. Oh, look at that. There you go. So all of these are completely free. And as you can see down there, so you can license them and use them in free personal and commercial projects. And all of these here will work in the same workflows that we've been doing. And look, it just goes on and on and on and on and on, right? I can look up something like Chrome, and we have some Chrome materials. Definitely the more premium ones you'll find with an Adobe stock subscription. But for the most part, you can get a lot of textures completely free that you can use in all of your projects, which is great. You can also put in some little florals. Who knows, right? Have fun with it. All right, so we're gonna start working on the top of our dial. So I'm gonna grab my ellipse tool, draw one out, just like that. And like the other textures and elements that we've been working on, we're going to start off with a gradient. Now, going back to what Cornell was asking earlier about copying and pasting styles and things like that, even though this doesn't directly touch on his question, but if we wanted to very quickly get a head start on this dial, we can dive into the ring group, grab the base color, copy, and then paste appearance. And now we have a nice starting point, right? And I could have sworn, I'm probably going crazy, but I could have sworn you could have adjusted the size of an angular gradient. But maybe I'm completely wrong. I know you can move it and you can rotate it. I think I'm losing my mind. That's got to be it. All right, so we have that, but we may want to tweak some of these other styles. May not want a border at the moment, but we may want a little bit of an inner shadow. And we're going to go for, I don't know, let's go for like a darker brown. Something like this. Bump up the opacity quite a bit. And what I'm trying to get at for this is I'm actually going to bring the Y position into the negatives. Let's say around -3. I don't want the opacity to drop. And what I'm going for this is a little bit of almost like a highlight at the bottom. So it looks like it has a bit of a bevel, right? And I think I may want to just go through here and just tweak the colors a little bit. Just so that we have a bit more color in there. Maybe a little bit more red, possibly. Darken it a touch. I can definitely come back to this later once we start adding some additional textures in there. But something like this will give us a little bit of a bevel right at the bottom. Just like that. And then we're going to duplicate the layer one more time. Let me actually just go ahead and dial. And this will be our base color. I'm going to duplicate, and just like the ring, we are going to add a chrome texture. And I'm going to paste the appearance or drag and drop. Let's set this to overlay. And this will give us the opportunity to add another inner shadow, but it's going to be, someone's asking, is this live or repeat telecast? I think this is live, unless I am some sort of a robot who can predict the future and what everyone's going to say. which is possible. You never know. But I'm going to add a little bit of an inner shadow at the top. Drop this down a touch. Perfect. And then finally, one more layer. And this is going to be our scratches layer. I'm going to make sure to name this one as well. This is going to be our chrome. And then on this one here, we're going to grab our scratches texture and boop. Now that's a little bit too much, so we are going to drop this to about soft light, which is a nice balance like I was talking about earlier. You can also experiment with the opacity a little bit. There we go. And if you wanted to, you can also add another inner shadow. So maybe at the bottom, maybe a very subtle inner shadow just to give a little bit more of a bevel down there. And now I can definitely go back and make some changes if I need to. Ooh, look at that. Just pulled that up a little bit and all of a sudden we've got this nice shiny look to it. Fancy. All right. Again, like I mentioned earlier, so much experimentation has to happen to get elements like this. You know, a lot of people watch these streams and my videos are like, oh, it's so seamless for him. He does it so easily. But they don't know about the literal 20 hours I spent getting to the point where I'm somewhat happy with the design before I have to press that go live button. So it takes time. So if you're getting discouraged that you can't create something that looks like this, even though it's not perfect, but if you can't create something like this immediately on the first try, I can't either, trust me. All right, so I'm gonna group these and call this dial top. And now we can start creating the side. So again, reminder, on this example here, we have the top, right? And we also have the side right here. So just to give it a little bit of a 3D kind of perspective look, and I should probably point out, some of you might notice that the top, once you start adding in the side, if you were to keep it completely round like this, it would look a little bit strange. So eventually, once we finish the side, we're just gonna shrink it down a little bit, just so that it looks like it's on a bit of an angle. You could also use something like 3D transforms, and view, look at that. Or you can grab all of this stuff, and the indent as well, and whew, look at that. Might have to experiment a little bit with the styles as well, but yeah, you can put 3D transforms on these things. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the side of this particular element, and then we'll move on to the glow at some point. So what I'm gonna do is on this top of the dial, I started the process off with an ellipse. But in this case, I actually wanna start off with a rectangle. And the reason I'm doing that is I want more control over the corners and the edges of these shapes. So I'm gonna grab the rectangle. I'm gonna start it off nice and square, because that'll allow me to round out the corners completely. But when the time comes, I'll be able to just pull this up a little bit and kind of hide some of this behind the layer at the top, right? All right, so now that we have this in place, we are going to start adding some style. So I'm gonna go hop into the fill. Now, this time we are not gonna be using an angular gradient. We could probably get away with it, but because this element is not really a flat element, it's more of an object that is almost rounded. Well, I guess it probably is rounded. We'll want something like either a radial gradient or a linear gradient. So let's try linear. We'll go horizontal, so left to right. And then we'll go through and start defining some of these colors. So for example, on the left-hand side, we might want a nice darkish bronzish red, and that's gonna start to transition into a more lighter color. So we'll do something like this, right? And we'll do more of a neutral in the middle. And on the right-hand side, we might wanna actually sample this color up here, or you can copy and paste the hex code and kind of repeat that process until it meets in the middle. And like all of our other elements, we'll likely have to go back and make some tweaks, especially once some of the textures are in place. Now we're gonna add a bit of an inner shadow. Now this is gonna look a little bit strange, and it may not make sense right away, and we can always do this later, but I want to actually, I'm gonna bring this into the negatives a little bit, so the inner shadow's kind of at the bottom. I'm gonna actually bump it up in the Y position so that it's touching the left-hand side as well. Maybe I'll blur it just a little bit. But what I want to do is actually add a little bit of color in here. So we're gonna add something like this red, and maybe 65%, somewhere around there. And what this is going to accomplish is it's going to almost make it feel like there's a reflection. Because the fabric behind it, or I guess in front of it, in this case, if we're talking about perspective, because the fabric is this nice bright red, it's going to naturally reflect the color off of this shiny material. Right now it doesn't look very shiny, but we're going to start adding some textures in a moment, and it's going to start to give that impression that it is shiny. So we'll go back and revisit this in just a few minutes. So we've got this, and we have our side, and this is going to be base color. We are going to duplicate this, and for this one, this is going to be our ridges. So if you remember on this example here, there's these little ridges on the side of this particular element, right? It almost looks like there's little cuts in the metal. And it's very typical, you would see this in metal dials on things like music mixers and elements like that. So I'm gonna hop over to Finder, and I do have, let's see, where is the ridges? So this one here, I did grab a similar image from Adobe stock. I brought it into Photoshop, made a few tweaks. I used the Spherify, I believe, filter, so that it kind of adds a little bit of perspective, and that's gonna work great on an element like this because it's supposed to be wrapping around that dial, right? So I'm gonna copy that, paste it in here, right? And I can double click, or I can press return and make changes to this. I can bring that up and then like that. Or I can leave it at that. Kind of has that perspective in there, right? Perfect. And then for the blend mode, let's experiment again. We might want to go something like overlay. Oh, look at that. And then maybe bring down the opacity a touch. And just like that, we're starting to get some texture in there. We're starting to, it feels almost tactile, which is wonderful. So I'm going to duplicate this one more time. And this is going to be our lovely chrome material. And this is really going to start to bring it to life. I'm going to paste that in there. Overlay looks pretty good. Maybe I'll crank up the opacity a little bit just to bring more of that, shininess into this. And we can also add a little bit of an inner shadow on some of these materials as well. And we'll do something like just a very subtle inner shadow on the bottom and side. Because if you remember, this dial is kind of going to be almost indented into this fabric. So by adding these shadows onto these elements, it's going to look like it's going into that hole at the bottom. And it'll make more sense once we actually put this behind the top layer. And then finally, we may want maybe one more material just to really bring this home. So I'm going to duplicate this one more time, and this is going to be more of a darker chrome material. I'm going to paste that in there, and maybe I'll just switch this over to soft light, just so it's not too harsh. Experiment a little bit, and again, you can tweak the inner shadow, drop shadow, all that fun stuff if you need to. All right, so now we have all of these in place. This is going to be our side. I'm going to move this behind the top. Actually, I'm going to name this dial side. I can either move the top above the side or the side below the top, lots of different ways. And obviously it's looking a little bit strange right now. And that's because things just don't line up perfectly. But you remember, we used a rounded rectangle, or a rectangle with rounded corners, rather than the top, or the ellipse, right, that we used for the top. So now we can just grab this and move it on up. And now we have this nice straight edge on the side, which makes it feel a little bit more like an actual dial, right? Now I think there's too much separation there. So what I would probably do is just move this up a little bit and then pull this up a touch. And we're starting to get there. Now, of course, we're not there yet, right? It's still lacking some depth. It's still lacking some shadows. It kind of just connects down here at the bottom. Doesn't look like it's going into something. So there's more we can do, right? Let's start with the indent of this particular element. All right. Perfect. Okay. Just checking comments. And what we're going to do here is at the bottom, we could go ahead and use another rounded rectangle. So I'll duplicate this one at the bottom and I'll call this one indent. That way I can go ahead and pull this upward to the side if I needed to. And because we want to see some of this indent, I'm actually going to just drop it a little bit. So I'm just using the down arrow just to drop it a touch. I can pull it outwards a little bit if I needed to. But let's start with that and we'll see how that works. And for the fill, we don't need anything too crazy with this. So we're going to go for a solid color and we'll go for a nice dark red somewhere in this area here. And maybe we'll set the blend mode like we did with the indent to something like hard light, which is going to start interacting with that fabric below it. And then we'll add, let's say, a drop shadow. Now this one we want, very similar to what we did up here, we want it to almost give us a little bit of a bevel, right? So we're going to go somewhere up here. And we'll set this at 0. And we'll set the drop shadow at 3 for the Y position. Maybe we'll bump this up. Ooh, look at that. Okay, we're getting there. Not there yet, but we're getting there. And then we're going to blur the entire thing. So we have a nice indent with a bit of a, you know, a ridge on the side or the front. And we'll set this to around 1. So it's getting there. It's not there yet, right? And this is where the experimentation comes into play. I'm going to drop the color of this particular element a little bit, or at least the shadow, and then drop that a touch as well. We can add a bit of a border, that might help, or we can add an inner shadow, maybe at the bottom. So we're starting to see a little bit of that indent, so it almost looks like it's kind of dipping into this particular shape. Not there yet. Let me actually hide the top because it's bothering me a touch. But you know, we can start also adding in some additional, let's say, shadows to some of these elements, right? So maybe down here, we might want to bump this up a touch. Experiment with that. Just until we have a fairly decent indent. Not perfect. Definitely experiment with some things, but it's getting there, right? But this top, the top to the side, it's just not really working, right? It doesn't look like it connects, doesn't look like it has depth. It's missing shadows probably, which, by the way, one more thing we can do is we can add a much larger shadow that kind of fades away. So we do have these rounded rectangles. I can actually use one of these. So this could be maybe side long shadow. And then we'll probably do something like soft light. We can pull this outwards. And then let's say we'll do a linear gradient. Maybe the top color will be dark. We'll do both colors as dark, but the one at the bottom, the opacity is going to be quite a bit lower, if not at 0. Get rid of some of these styles. We're going to blur it a little bit, and then we can also rotate it as well. Just so we have a little bit of a shadow coming off this object, right? And you experiment, soft light, overlay. Okay, not bad. That could work. I could even dive in here, and if I unround out the corners just a little bit, grab these, maybe move them out a little bit so there's a bit of a, I don't know what you call it, so it just kind of flares out a touch. Look at that. All right. But again, that top section, it's just looking not great, right? So what we might want to do is create an element very similar to this little glowing element, almost like this bevel or this bezel at the top that kind of connects both of these pieces. So that's what we're going to do. We are going to, let's actually just duplicate this top layer, right? We're going to hide one of them. And this is where all the elements that we're going to be using for our glow is going to come into place. So we're going to start with our base color, right? We're going to start with a nice, let's reset that, and we're going to go for a radial gradient. And we'll do something like in the middle, maybe this, maybe we could just do a, I don't know, what do we want to do? Maybe we can just do a solid color. We don't have to get too fancy with this. Maybe we'll do a solid color, something like this. We can always go back and make some changes. And we might want a bit of a drop shadow. very subtle. Something like that. All right. Or maybe we do want to, let's actually, you know what? Let's do a radial gradient. Just so we have a little bit of a, you know, when it goes further back, it's going to almost looks like it, you know, fades away or it gets not as bright, for example. Something like that. There we go. So it's a little bit brighter at the front, a little bit darker on the back, in the back. And we'll give it a little bit of a shadow. Maybe a nice pink. Very subtle shadow. Or, sorry, a border, I should say. And this is going to make a little bit more sense once the actual glows come into play. So it looks like a little bit of a bevel on the inside. Something like that. Drop the opacity a touch so it blends really nicely. Now, this next layer, we're actually not going to be using Chrome for this. Actually, let me delete these. We're not going to be using Chrome for this, but we are going to be using another texture, and that's going to be sort of like a LED display type of texture. And I do have this one right here. I also have this one. I have so many different textures, but this one I did the same thing. I went into Photoshop, I applied that Spherify or Spherize filter, and I'm going to paste this in here. And we'll do something like color dodge. We can make this a little bit larger. Right, something like that. We can always go back and experiment, and we'll do maybe a little bit of a drop shadow. I know I'm running out of time, but let's go ahead and try to wrap this dial up. We'll do something like pink, drop the opacity. A little bit of a drop shadow, and then one more. And this is going to be where the glow actually comes into play. So we'll do something like a solid color here. And you can already see that this is starting to glow because we have a nice blend mode of color dodge. We have a little bit of a drop shadow. We can add a little bit of an object blur, right? All of a sudden, we have a little bit of glow going on. Pop that into place. We can turn on our top. And now if we start, you know, tweaking some of this, move this upwards like I showed earlier, grab the glow, move that down a touch. We're starting to see things kind of come into play, right? Into place. And from here, once you get to this point, you know, a lot of it is all about experimentation from this point on, right? So, you know, increasing the size of the shadow or the border a little bit, maybe bumping it up a touch, or maybe even grabbing that LED texture, making it a little bit smaller. And just really experimenting with every little piece. And then maybe we can add a bit of a, so on this base color, we can add a bit of a drop shadow. Something like that, and then really blur it quite a bit. Just so that there's a little bit more depth there. I'm gonna name this one, what was this? This is the glow. And this one is the LED. Drop this a little bit so it's not too harsh. Maybe 60% could work. And you can start to see how these little tiny elements, right? This very subtle drop shadow kind of comes into play. Let's see. All right. Perfect. And then this one here, maybe I'll add a bit of a shadow or a stroke on this one or a border. Very subtle. And if you zoom out, you can kind of see how things are coming along. And push that inwards just to make it look a little bit more realistic. And I'm thinking this side looks a little bit too chunky still. So I might just want to pull both of these elements down a touch and then grab that side. And then pull these down as well. And just like that, we have started the process of creating this dial, right? And from here, the sky's the limit. Very quickly, I can go ahead and select all of these, turn it into a component, And let's say I did have maybe like a light at the top, but what you can do is create a new state, maybe a toggle state, for example, and then grab some of these elements like the scratches and all that stuff. You know, you can rotate. Now this isn't a perfect circle, so you're gonna get a little bit of weirdness, but you can rotate things. You can make this thing actually work. You can add sound effects and the whole 9 yards. So that is going to wrap it up for me for today. That was a lot of fun, but we only covered a little bit of it. Maybe we'll cover more next week, or we'll do something. Actually, we're off next week, but the week after, we may revisit the app from last week, or we may continue some of this stuff. Definitely let me know on Twitter what you would like to see in future masterclasses. Big thank you to everyone who has tuned in. Oh no, it looks like, I don't know if you can all see me, but I just got an error message. Maybe I'm getting kicked off. I don't know. But if you're still here and you can see me, big thank you for tuning in. Kyle T. Webster's coming up in just a few moments, and I will see you all next time. Maybe.